Welcome to In Body, In Mind. Join us as we explore the world of alternative and complementary health, wellness and life experiences. In this episode, Jean-Michel David discusses the sacred movement of Paneurythmy and how it applies to the principles of love, wisdom and truth, and is a method of balancing the physical, mental and spiritual forces with humanity.
Today it is my great pleasure to introduce to you my great friend Jean-Michel David. And Jean-Michel and I have known each other for a number of years. We've had many conversations late at night and over dinner about a range of topics to do with yoga, philosophy, spirituality, astrology, and mainly these conversations are me asking Jean-Michel questions because I've actually never come across anybody with a broader range of knowledge. I think the word polymath is what I would use to describe Jean-Michel, and truly amazing the depth of knowledge, and not just from an intellectual point of view. This is a man who has lived and practiced and taught in most of the fields that he's interested in. And so I would say that there's a purpose in your studies and in your teachings, from yoga teaching to meditation teaching to school teaching, and now the sacred dance, circle teaching, which I really want to talk to you about today, Paneurythmy, which is something that you introduced to myself and Davey and other members of the Southwest community, this beautiful form of dance. So after that introduction, we've got an hour or so to really go deep into some of the areas, because I think what I'd like to come out of this conversation is to learn a little bit more about how Paneurythmy came about, the founder of Paneurythmy, but from your point of view, how this seems to bring together, you know, a lot of the areas of interest that you're involved in a real experiential way, and I think that's what makes it very profound. So,
okay. Well,
over to you.
Thanks. Yeah, it's hard to follow on from the introduction.
Well,
so, what did they say about humility? I can't recall now, but it's something about don't go by how a person introduces you, otherwise the true humility won't be there. So, yeah, polymath is, thank you. Certainly have a range of interests, that's for sure. And with Paneurythmy, I think I've described it to you as well in the past and to some people in terms of giving a first kind of brief overview introduction without doing the actual movements yet, as a form of Bulgarian Tai Chi to music. It's probably the easiest way to briefly describe it. It isn't Tai Chi. It does come out of Bulgaria. It is a form of cosmic dance to some music that Peter Deunov put together as well. I'll talk a bit about Peter Deunov. And it lasts approximately 1 hour. I have to say approximately because when you're doing something live, if you have some live musicians there, and as you know, I've just returned from Bulgaria a few weeks ago, we practice Paneurythmy in different parts with live musicians, and of course, depending on who's keeping the rhythm, you can last under 1 hour, you can last 1 hour and 10 minutes. It's the violinists, the guitarists, the other players, the people singing.
They set the pace.
The song, they set the pace. So it can vary. And also the short breaks in between each movement can vary from a few seconds to sometimes 30 seconds. And so they can add up to the end. But that was only to give you a quick, or to give the listener really a quick sense of the duration. It is a spiritual cosmic dance. And the word Paneurythmy, I might go back one step as well with that, just to explain a bit of the word. About 100 years ago, nearly everybody that went to school in Europe learned, apart from their own language, learned 2 other languages. They learned some Greek and they learned some Latin. So if any word was made up of Greek roots, then you didn't have to explain what it meant. Everyone just understood it. And so you have 3 different words that use the term eurythmy that developed from the late 1800s to the 1930s. The first one was eurythmics in France, which It's got nothing to do with paneurythmy. And in fact, when my mother was in a boarding school, when she was quite young, just outside of Paris, they did eurythmics. And there's a school in Melbourne that also, a girls' school in Melbourne that also in the 1930s also did eurythmics from the same tradition. Eurythmy, literally the EU part, just means graceful, good, etc., or mainly good or healthy. And so you have eustress, which is good stress. And rhythm or rhythmy just means flow. So you have this word even for some Latin writers of the 2nd century, and they talked about a eurythmic armor, which is a armor that flowed on the body of the warrior, which is not necessarily what we want to use eurythmy for. But the word eurythmy just means good rhythm or good flow.
And pan is holistic, isn't it?
And pan is universal.
Okay.
So then the second type of the word then develops with Rudolf Steiner, eurythmy. That's probably the best known around. And Steiner and Peter Deunov do have a relation, which I'll talk about a little bit. But again, the eurythmy there is quite different, which I'm not going to talk about unless you ask me questions about it.
No, we'll keep this as an introduction.
Yep. And so paneurythmy, what happened is Peter Deunov. So Peter Deunov was born in 1864 and in Bulgaria. His father was a priest, and which is probably a lot of people don't realize that in the Eastern tradition, priests are usually married. Eastern Orthodox tradition. So when I'm talking about basically the pan-European continent here, so it's all based on the Western esoteric traditions with some influences from the East, and I'll talk about that as well, if time permits.
And this, I mean, part of the reason we'll come back to this as well, and I don't want to interrupt you, but this fusion of the East and West is something that really attracted you as well, because I know that that's something that you've
it's really grounded in Western esoteric tradition.
Right.
But what's really fascinating in Bulgaria is, now Bulgaria is on the west end of the Black Sea, and it's really at this junction of East and West.
Yes.
So you have quite a lot of Eastern influences. And actually, I'll go straight into the Eastern influences or the crossover influences.
Excellent.
So I'm going to go back a few centuries, actually a couple of millennia, just to give a bit of a background. In India, you've got the basic Hinduism, for want of a better term, and you've got two reform movements that occurs around 500 BC. You've got Gautama that develops Buddhism, and probably 50 years before, you've got Jainism as well, the Jains that develop. Virtually identical kind of reform movements.
Right.
Jainism flows mainly south and west.
Yes.
And Buddhism flows mainly south and east.
Yes.
And so with the flow westward, eventually that gets, I'll say, destroyed by the Islamic movements that's in the west. So most of what is now Pakistan used to be Jain.
It's dissolved.
Yeah, maybe I shouldn't be careful with my words here, but yeah. But Jainism, my sense is that in the 3rd century, when Mani was around in what is now
Manichaeism.
So
what an incredible case. We could do a whole talk on
Manichaeism is really
and another prophet of the times, really, up there with the greatest masters throughout history.
Yeah, I actually put him way up there. Yeah.
Yes.
I personally believe that Mani, who came from a very small community in what is now Iran, in Persia.
And he also was he fused Gnosticism,
absolutely,
Catholicism, is another fusion of
total fusion there,
Christianity.
And one of the things I think that influenced him as well is Jainism. Right. That's not written in any of the history books, so I'm not going to. If you look that up, if somebody finds a reference to that, great, but I'm not aware of any.
Right.
What is peculiar is that both Jainism and Manichaeism are total vegetarians. They've got a sense of non-harm, which is, more extreme than most other places.
It's interesting. A lot of the Neoplatonists were vegetarians as well. I've only recently found out. So
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, although a lot of the Neoplatonists could eat fish. Right. And what's interesting with Manichaeism is it at its height, so that's around the 3rd century, and actually 4th century it really develops.
Right.
And at its height, it spread right on to the west to Britain and to the east to Japan. So it was really quite broad. And in west of Tibet, there was actually a small kingdom that was Manichaean as well, that developed in the 6th or 7th century. But in the West, that was basically, to a large extent, destroyed by, well, the Third Crusade is a good example of that, against the Cathars, which were a form of Reformed Manichaeans. In Bulgaria, the Bogomils were also influenced by
the Albigensian Crusades.
The Albigensian was the Third Crusade in the south of France.
Right.
In Bulgaria, you've got the Bogomils, which were also a form of Manichaean. Now, Peter Deunov talks about the Bogomil, if you like, the spiritual impulse in Bulgaria of the Bogomils. And this is what he works out of. Now, what were the Bogomils and what were the Manichaeans? They were also, in the Western form, they were also deep esoteric Christians. So Mani himself said that he was the comforter that is mentioned in the New Testament, the comforter being a kind of overshadowing from the Holy Spirit. So Peter Deunov is an esoteric Christian reformist.
Through this tradition.
And
that came through his family or his community, or
more, I think, himself. I think he rejected some of his own family background. Mm-hmm. He actually studied. He went to following the rejection of the Ottoman Empire in the 1880s, I think it was. He went over and studied theology in the United States.
Oh, I saw that.
Yes. From a Methodist college. So you do have a sense of a different kind of reform that also takes place. But the Bogomil tradition is definitely there. A lot of his works, a lot of his mantras, a lot of the prayers that he uses are grounded in esoteric Christianity.
And he was a musician.
He was also a musician.
And he wrote the music for Paneurythmy. He was a violinist.
Yep.
And some of the quotes that I've read about him from other people at that time, whether it was Einstein or Paramahansa Yogananda or Steiner, at the time, I think his height for Peter Deunov in the 1920s and 30s when he was most well known. I mean, he was regarded by these leaders of the world as being the greatest living master on the planet at that time.
Yeah.
And some of them probably hadn't even met him, but he was prolific. He was a prolific writer, wasn't he? And gave a lot of lectures, like thousands of lectures.
So what was interesting there is so I'll go into a little bit of that part. I don't want to make it too complicated either. No. This is the part, so, stop me if I go too.
Yeah, and stop me if I sidetrack you too.
No. There's no sidetracking with these things. It's what's relevant at the time, isn't it? So with Peter Deunov, then he born in 1864, 1880s or thereabouts, he goes over and does theology and some medicine in the US, comes back, and about 1906 forms a small movement with about 6 followers. A lot of the English translations of his title say the Master, but that is possibly an unfortunate translation, because in English, master has a definite meaning. Even in French, if I talk about my teacher in a school, if I talk about my teacher, I'll say my maître or maîtresse, which means my master or my mistress. Now, if I say the words in English, they mean something very different. They just means my teacher. So you do have other translations of his title just being the teacher rather than the master, which I think in English is a better translation. But in 1906 or thereabouts, he starts a movement called the Synaptic Chain. Now, what is with the word chain, nowadays we think of a chain as something that is solid, that binds. But really what is implied in the Western esoteric tradition by chain is connecting links. So every person makes a link that connects to others. And the social element of this connection becomes really important for him. With Synarchy, what you have, and that's been like a number of other things after the Second World War, there's some words you can't use, there's some symbols like the swastika that have become basically virtually inverted in meaning. Synarchy was a political movement that stems from the late 1800s that talks about division of society into a threefold way. And Steiner uses exactly the same model, where you have the teachings and the art and those things that need to have a kind of independent, autonomous existence to the legal political system, to the commercial system. And that was the basis of Synarchy. So the synarchic chain of those meetings was formed to either highlight and develop artistic elements, or to develop commerce, how people interact with each other for commerce, or what kind of legal political system works well. So that's the three parts of Synarchy. But if you look it up now, even on presumably Wikipedia, I should have checked before I say that, but I'm sure that you're going to find how it's been abused in some post-World War II developments.
So in this category where Rudolf Steiner obviously put a lot of emphasis on the education and the music being separate from the political arm and the economic arm of society, to help cultivate and nurture the creativity and imagination and spirituality of the young people, and free from those other influences, as it should be.
Yeah.
Right. Was this also what Peter
that
Deunov was teaching, and did that influence Rudolf Steiner?
The two independently. They were both
right.
They both developed out of an esoteric tradition that was written about in the late 1800s by a French guy called Saint-Yves, and he talked about that synaptic manner of organizing. And the reason why you do that with the education, for example, is that you're not educating a child to become a cog in the existing machine.
Right.
Rather, the existing political system, the existing commerce should arise out of developing the potential of each individual to their capacity. And then society reorganizes itself based on the capacities of the individuals that are developed to their full potential. So it's virtually inverse of what we have currently in society.
What we've had since the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, whereas how can I make this person a better cog in the machine?
Yeah.
And that is unfortunate.
That's why this is an important conversation. And so,
and Peter Deunov, there is also a school in Bulgaria. There might be more than one that develops out Peter Deunov's ideas. And from my what I saw of it about 8 years ago, I didn't go to it this time when I went a few weeks ago, but it seemed to me to be very much in parallel with some of Steiner's ideas about education as well. Yeah. But anyway, so putting that aside,
yes.
From that synaptic chain, from the chain of Peter Deunov in the early part of the 20th century, developed a series of exercises or movements as well. And over the course of the next 12, 15 years, eventually, and he also wrote a lot of music, eventually became Paneurythmy.
But at the same time, he had a community form around him.
Oh, yeah.
And so this movement exercise and dance exercise was something that he was developing for the community.
And not just for the community, he also talked about it being, if you wanted to maintain health,
Right.
It should go out from just their community, and members of the community, which eventually was renamed, which I'll go into later.
Right.
The paneurythmy, or the movements, were supposed to go out to all the different communities, so they could just practice that if they wanted to maintain health.
Yeah, when we've practiced it with you for the last few summers here at Yelling Up, and it's been a wonderful, wonderful experience on Sunday mornings. It's just so beautiful, the music, the movements, the grace, the pace that it's set at. But there's also, and I know this would be another area that you were probably attracted to, is also there's a sacred geometry about it, and a cosmology to it as well. How important was that to incorporate in?
Yeah, right. So when I started doing paneurythmy, I had already done a fair bit of eurythmy and also choreocosmos that Robert Pell developed out of eurythmy. And I also, obviously, as you know, was also doing yoga for quite a number of years before that. Actually, my mother was a yoga teacher as well, so probably most of my
and your sister and brother, so it's in the family.
My nephew, yes. Yeah, so there's that, but also my grandfather in France was also a member of an esoteric movement back in the early 1900s that also used a different form of, I'll call it Western yoga as well. There was no name for it, but it was maybe there was a name and I'm not aware of it too. So movement and a sense of that you need to do things harmoniously, and you need to slow down pace, you need to breathe, you need to pay attention to your thoughts, you need to pay attention to your movement, all that comes.
It is a moving meditation, I'd say that. It really is. And there is a moment when you flick from trying to remember the moves to
just doing it.
Just doing it. And so, it takes you into that meditative mind.
Oh, totally, And what Peter Deunov says is that if you're able to maintain that alert, gentle awareness whilst you're actually doing it for the whole time, you're actually connecting to the spiritual world. And I suppose that's one thing that also connects most of the both Eastern and Western traditions, is that we are not just physiological machines. We're actually spiritual beings in incarnation. And as spiritual beings in incarnation, we often can forget to reconnect to, I'm pointing up, but of course the spiritual is everywhere, not just up. Metaphorically, we point up generally for the spiritual. And it connects you to the star realm, to the spiritual realm that permeates the whole universe. And and paneurythmy does that in a very gentle form. And even if you only want to do paneurythmy simply as a movement that allows you to maintain some kind of movement and health, that some people practice Qigong or Tai Chi for that purpose, hence the reason why that analogy I gave earlier of Bulgarian Tai Chi.
And it's also a practice which involves partners as well. So there's there's a very strong social element to it, because there are several moves where you partner up.
Yeah, that's
and they're very beautiful moves. And
it's a pity. I don't know if
there's a strong sense of sort of the divine feminine and divine masculine coming together in the whole.
No, absolutely.
Movement.
And what's interesting is Peter Deunov also talked about that each individual has actually got masculine and feminine elements as well.
Yes.
So, but you've got the preponderance of one or the other, of course, through your incarnation. Now, so normally what happens is, of course, if you are partnered, then you would be doing it next to your partner. And there's on the 19th of August, actually not just the 19th of August, but the peak is the 19th of August in Bulgaria, in the near the Rila Lakes, about 3,000 meters up in the mountains. There's anywhere between 1,000 and 4,000 people that meet and doing the same dance, which is really quite amazing, really. But each time it's a pair of people. Now, he would want to use the word pair rather than couple, because often it's not necessarily a couple that joins, but you pair up with someone. You may or may not know that. Of course, if you're going there as a couple, you will pair up with your couple as a couple. And the other interesting thing is that as you're moving as a pair, there are 28 movements, and on the 13th one, and I'll go into the sacred geometry if you want to with the 13th, but on the 13th one, you actually swap over. So part of it, if you're starting off on the outside of the circle, then the rest of it, you're going to be on the inside of the circle. And for most of it, you're next to the person you're moving with. You're not facing them. So you could actually be you have to be totally aware of who's in front and who's behind to maintain your pace, to maintain distance to the person next to you as well. But as well as that, you can also be in that walking or moving meditation aspect. You can also have this internal connection then to the spiritual as well, and to internally supposed to again move from the heart. So you're not moving from the head, you're moving from the heart.
And with the violin music, it sort of drops you down into that sort of heart space.
Oh yeah,
naturally anyway, doesn't it?
It's very. And the violin is a, well, again, not talking about Peter Deunov, who was a violinist as well, but Rudolf Steiner talks about, or I should say, in anthroposophy, what's talked about is that the violin is the closest to the human voice,
right,
in terms of the sound it can make, which is quite an interesting, or the unfretted stringed instrument is.
So you've got the health benefits, you've got the community benefits, you've got the social benefits. It's a moving meditation.
Yeah,
it's done outdoors in nature, and where we do
normally barefoot.
Normally barefoot,
so you're
connecting to the earth. Whenever we're doing circle work, there's a sacred sort of geometry to that anyway, and we're moving in a circle. But then there's some square, triangle type movements going on within it. I haven't quite, because I'm so busy sort of keeping up with the movements to,
especially when you're still grasping it, and if you don't do it all the time,
So there's all those benefits to it, which are just great to do anyway, at any age. I mean, I can see any age, children through to elderly folk being able to participate.
I think of one person that came regularly, 84.
Yeah, absolutely.
Definitely,
And so from a self-realization point of view, is it a process, did Peter Deunov or do any of these people that practice this see this as something that they actually progress in terms of an inner, science? Right. Is that presented like that? Like yoga is in the sense that we understand it, is a transformative process,
right,
and not just a physical one.
Okay.
At that level, when you start to
actually do it.
Form an intention that, this is also about what's happening in the inner world, and it's an opportunity to explore what that's about and where that could lead. Yeah. I mean, does you see people approach paneurythmy from that?
Yeah, I'll give an analogy.
Or would that be a fundamentalist paneurythmy?
Yeah. Look, I think you're spot on.
Right.
But I'll give it by an analogy.
Yes.
Because the yoga analogy will be a useful one for maybe some of the viewers anyway. If I look at Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, and so in the second chapter, he talks about the 8 limbs of yoga. So
Ashtanga.
The Ashtanga, So the 8 limbs of yoga, if you look at the first 2, you've got basically the rules. In other words, how do you live in the world? How do you function? How do you interact? So with Peter Deunov, there's something similar with Paneurythmy. It's not just about the movement, and I'll get back to that. It's how do you live? Are you truthful? Do you live with love? Do you live with
non-violence?
Wisdom? Yes, himself or in
truthfulness, cleanliness,
exactly. All those things. Yes. So all those things in the Yoga Sutras have got the equivalent in all of the esoteric traditions.
Yes.
Yet when people think of yoga, they often skip those first 2 limbs. They even skip the third one, and they go straight to the asanas. In other words, to the postures, to the moves.
Yes.
So if you think about it, there's something similar as well in Paneurythmy, is in which there is a whole teaching that's behind it that supports it. But when people do paneurythmy, you can just go and do the equivalent of the asanas. In other words, you can just go and do the movements.
Yes.
But if you really want to have a personal transformation, it will still help you the personal transformation. If I do an asana, if I really maintain the asana, I'm going to be more conscious of my body. I'm going to be more sensitive to how I may harm myself, and therefore more sensitive how I may harm others.
Where's the prana, moving to and from and through, and
yes. So even the prana, and therefore with the breathing techniques, there's also breathing techniques also that is associated that Peter Deunov talks about too. So you've got these aspects, but even then you're talking about the first four limbs.
Yes.
Then the next four limbs start to really take you inwards and out. So the next four limbs with Patanjali's Yoga Sutras.
Dharana, Dhyana, Samadhi, Pratyahara.
And Pratyahara, that's right. So the Pratyahara is withdrawing from the senses. You're not actually conscious through the external senses, but you're developing the inner senses. And now I'm going to go back to Peter Deunov and to the Western esoteric tradition, although they have their correlates in the Eastern. What are the two most important elements of the Pratyahara version to go inwards to actually activate and sense into the activities of the pineal gland, the pituitary gland, and the cerebral spinal fluid going down the Sushumna, if you want to talk about
surrounding the spinal cord and the brain.
That's right.
Sort of like pickled in cerebral spinal fluid.
And that has its own inner light that can actually be measured. It actually, and you don't want the pineal gland to be ossified, to be calcified. So those movements that you do, that with the internal aspect of that meditative quality, can help to decalcify. The other thing that helps to decalcify the pineal gland are two things. One of them is the magnetic connection to the earth. So again, you remove your shoes, you walk on the earth barefoot. They can actually help the magnetic body of the human being to actually be more in tune. And the other one that Peter Deunov and Steiner and other people talk about, it's also in the Eastern tradition too, is first thing in the morning at dawn. So dawn is just before the sun rises. People think of dawn after the sun. There's a reason, but it's actually just before the sun rises.
There's a sweet spot there, isn't
there? Yeah, sweet spot, yeah.
Yes.
So you go out there, you actually observe that eastern horizon, and you see the very first rays of light. And that has got an increased magnetic effect on the human being that they can help to actually bring the person more in tune with themselves and also decalcify the pineal glands. So Peter Deunov specifically talks about the importance of actually observing the rising sun in the morning.
Horus rising.
Well, it is, yes. Rising. It is, right, exactly, yeah. But he actually makes that one of the key exercises, apart from paneurythmy and some other things too. So you get up, you observe the rising sun, and in one place he actually says something that if you are suffering from depressive states, if you are able to, for 3 consecutive mornings, rise before sunrise, observe the rising sun, even if you go back to sleep afterwards, right? That will actually significantly help a tendency to depression. So that's in part answering again, that analogy with yoga, in which the asana is one of the 8 limbs in yoga, in which sense then the paneurythmy movements are one of the there's no specific number, but I'll say 8 limbs of the greater part that you're interacting with other people, you're doing all those things you mentioned before, and therefore you are also developing yourself into a more awake, caring, truthful, etc. human being. And there's one more part that I'll mention in terms of there's a particular series of movements to do with the pentagram, which I'll talk about too, if you like.
Yeah, we might get onto that, because only out of my own personal curiosity, I should also mention here that you'll be taking a paneurythmy dance what's that? Do you call it a dance? No, it's more of a circle.
I call it
movement.
dance,
it's movement.
Yeah.
No, I wouldn't. Yeah, I think movement is the word. Yeah, and that's exactly how I feel. Just a beautiful, beautiful movement, and you'll be taking a paneurythmic movement at this Yelling Up Wellness Expo on the 19th of November. So anyone listening to this podcast, you've already heard me mention the Yelling Up Wellness Expo. Jean-Michel will be there, and there'll be an opportunity to come along and experience paneurythmy for yourself. So I think you and with your children, bring the whole family. So the festival coming up in November, the Wellness Expo, you'll be taking the paneurythmy movement, but earlier in the morning you'll be also taking a meditation class in the Yelling Up Hall. Because you teach meditation, you're a Kundalini yoga teacher, but I think your meditations are great for anybody. So perhaps you could just give us a little bit of an introduction to what you'll be focusing on in this meditation for anybody that's interested.
I'm more interested for the meditation to give some simple techniques to develop a regular meditative practice. So even some things I just mentioned before about the impact of the pineal and pituitary in the cerebrospinal fluid, you can internally focus, again, the pratyahara in yoga. What I'll be doing is also presenting some of the neuroscientific evidence for the benefits of meditation. So in the past year, I was also working for Mindful Meditation Australia, and there I was presenting in some cases to doctors in hospitals and other places about the neuroscience and meditation. So some of the input that I had for that is generally available everywhere. So there's enormous amount of information about the positive impacts and some very simple practices that can really help somebody to get into a meditative practice using very simple techniques. So that's basically what we'll be focusing on. If you're an experienced meditator, you'll probably gain a lot of benefit as well. But if you've never meditated before,
before the sun rises or at a more civilized?
Oh, you can look. If you want to do it before the sunrise, you can join me then. But no, this is at 9 o'clock, I think, from memory. 8 o'clock.
8 a.m. on Sunday.
It's 8 o'clock.
Sunday, the 19th of November. And just swinging back to our discussion on paneurythmy, we were going to talk a little bit more about some of the cosmology that's woven into it, which I know intrigues you, and I know you also teach in this area. Mm-hmm. And you've written a book. This man's written a book on the tarot, not just any tarot, a 16th century special edition version. I think I've got the book here, but and we've had a few discussions about this over the years as well. But for the same reason we spoke about paneurythmy, there's a lot of elements of the tarot which incorporate the fusion between the West and the East, and theology and philosophy, and deep esoteric wisdom. So, is there any anything you want to add, to sort of bring in that might sort of link? I guess the reason why you're so passionate about both schools, really.
Yeah. Well, I'll just mention something about paneurythmy and tarot, which Peter Deunov does not mention, by the way. I remember there was one time back in about 15 years ago or so, I was doing paneurythmy every single morning before sunrise, before going to work. I was living on the outskirts of Melbourne at the time, with a few exceptions over 7 years in which it was raining too heavily. But most of the time, even if it rained, it stopped before I started and only started again after I finished, which was amazing. But I think it was about the 5th year I was doing it every single day, paneurythmy. It's normally done only from the equinox to the equinox during the if you like, spring and summer. But I was doing it every day because the weather here permits it. And about the 5th year, as I was doing it, I realized that every single movement also corresponds to the exact same progression of tarot. the tarot major arcana, okay, or the trump cards. So there's 22 of those. There are 28 movements, and it's as if after you do the 22, based on the tree of life, which Peter Deunov and Rudolf Steiner do talk about that, it's as if after that there's a double descent back. So you've ascended to the spiritual heights, and then there's a double descent back. And it's that in that descent back to the earth, that's the times that you actually are dancing facing or directly connecting with the person that you're dancing with, which is really interesting. They're the only times. So the 22nd onwards. And so there is a connection then from my perspective with the tarot, and also with the Kabbalistic tree of life pattern.
Well, connections like
it's as if you're working
from principles, from sort of first fundamental principles,
but more than that,
underlying. But then you've now connected this on a physical.
Yeah, because even some of the movements, for example, the first movement.
Yes.
If you actually look at what the butler, or sometimes translated as the magician card, the person actually does. There's one description that Tomba gives in Meditations on the Tarot, for example, in which is that card, you can also describe it as the movements of a tightrope walker. And if you look at the very first movement in Paneurythmy, there's again a similar quality to it. It's kind of effortless movement. And so you start off with this effortless movement, which is, again, Tomba writes something similar on Meditations on the Tarot. He doesn't talk about Paneurythmy at all, of course, in that book. And what you have is this direct connection. The only time in Paneurythmy in which you have your feet off the ground, which is jumping, then you actually bend over at one stage before you jump, so your head is virtually reversed, corresponds exactly to the hangman.
I was going to say the hangman.
Yeah, so the time that you swap over is exactly the time that is death with a scythe. So it's as if you're moving, and this is a weaving between the two people that are next to one another. The Evera, which is the 11th movement, this incredible feminine form of moving is exactly the same form of inner strength that you have with the strength card, in which is allowing the jaws of the lion to open. You can't force the jaws of the lion to open if the lion doesn't want you to. So it's effortless strength, which is that beauty, the inner beauty and inner strength that comes from that connection to the spiritual. So I can go to, when you go to think, which is this movement here, you've got a continuous progression of allowing something to
very
allow
graceful,
to
that movement, isn't it?
It is.
I mean, when we see an arc type shape,
yeah,
it's a natural sense that there's something graceful about it.
And it's temperance, tarot.
Right.
In the tarot, so and again, I can mention every single one of them,
Yes.
And I know with sometimes there are people that are moving with us that know a fair bit about tarot. I'll just remind them, I'll think of, and it makes a direct connection. But it's really quite fascinating, the direct connection. And then also with, strictly speaking, in Paneurythmy, there are 3 sections. There's 28 movements. Then there is also a series of movements called the Rays of the Sun, which Peter Deunov talks about, that middle section of which is the breakaway from being bound to, effectively using Eastern forms, to your karma. How do you actually break away from that? And it's by a recognition of this birthing process, which if we had more time, I'll say a bit more about it, but it's as if it reflects the incarnation, your from incarnation to incarnation through the planetary spheres.
Yes.
And then the third type of movement is the pentagram, in which you have ideally 10 people in pairs, so 5 positions, and you are going to move into a pentagram and swap positions, so you occupy every single point of the pentagram. And the pentagram, Peter Deunov talks about each point having a very important virtue. I'll just use the term virtue, and for want of a better term, here they are. There's truth, at the top. So this is a vital element. Without truth, there is no inner freedom. Then there's justice or equilibrium. The Bulgarian term used is normally translated as justice, but it also implies equilibrium. There's wisdom, there's love, and there's virtue. How do you develop inner virtue? So those five virtues, even though one of them is called virtue there, become in your movements, you are continuously moving from one point to the next. And it's really fascinating to do that.
You said that because I got a quote, someone, I can't recall where I got it from, but it was summary, I think, or an introduction to one of Peter Deunov's book. And he says, love is the perfect way of truth and life. Make good the foundations of your home. Justice, your message of things, your measure of things, sorry. I need my glasses. Mm-hmm. Wisdom, your shield, and truth, your light. Only then will you come to know me, and I shall reveal myself to you.
So sometimes
that was
Peter Deunov also, he allows the spiritual impulse to speak through him. Yes, so in Paneurythmy movements, whenever you move forward, you are addressing truth. Any movement to the right, or your hand moving to the right, is wisdom. And any movement or hand to the left is love. So those are the three of those five virtues that Peter Deunov talks about that form a kind of centrality of even the movements in Paneurythmy. And then there's also, so in one of the movements, the 17th movement, the square, like in astrology, where square becomes, in astrology, it basically shows a bit of a tension that needs to be resolved. So that's one of the ones that even if you were to do parts of Paneurythmy, you never do that one by itself. Because as you're creating this tension to be released, then you balance it out by the following two, which includes a masculine and a feminine harmonizing sequence. So, but yeah, truth, wisdom and love are really important considerations. And what happens too is, because in Paneurythmy you're moving in an anti-clockwise circle, which is a little bit unusual for Northern Hemisphere work. Because you're moving in anti-clockwise, you always have, except for the square, you always have your left to the center. So your left, your centrality is to do with love.
Gravitation sort of is.
Yeah,
the centrifugal sort of line of energy.
Is love, which connects, and the singers, the musicians are in the center, which connects also then to the cosmic part. And the left that you go out into the world is with wisdom. So you're drawing from the love and you're going out with wisdom. At the end of Paneurythmy, you also greet each other, and always the right hand is down, the left hand up. Again, Western esoteric tradition, you receive with your left, you give with your right. So it's as if that wisdom and love connect as well. But yeah, it's quite, there's so many little parts. He talks about that each part of the body, so even the arm, has got a spiritual, a soul, and a physical element. But even in the finger, you've got three parts. So you've got the spiritual, the soul, and the physical element. So even as you're doing, for example, a movement that looks like flying, for example, so wing, you are not leading from the physical, you are leading from the spiritual, and that actually allows the movement of the arm to go, which is the opposite. If you're doing it as an exercise, often you're doing it from the physical outwards. This, you allow the periphery to lead, connecting to the spiritual. In the movement around, in the walking, I'll say, you put your toes first rather than your heel first, for exactly the same reason. Again, you're leading with a spiritual connectedness to the center of the earth. And then the solidity of the heel also then connects the physical.
There's something about doing it that brings up some sort of familiarity. I don't know what it is.
Yeah.
And do you get that feedback from people? It's like, I've never done anything like it before. I haven't been involved in folk, sort of folky type, folksy sort of, even sort of medieval sort of quality. There's something that sort of seems, oh wow, yeah, I can feel like, you know, some familiarity here. Where does that come from? And it must be, you know,
again, the connectedness to
it's
personally, I think it's a true reflection of a spiritual movement that is already infused in the body that you allow to discover. And there's something similar then with eurythmy in anthroposophy with Steiner, in that, you know, you do have some movements that are in terms of the letters, for example, the B, you know, even if you think about the baby as you're holding the baby, or the ah. So there's something natural that arises out of the human body for the sounds.
Aha, the first and last letters of the Sanskrit alphabet.
For example, that too. So, and so those things, I think, reflect in the human body.
Yes.
And reflect in the human body as microcosm to the macrocosm. So in that sense, there is a total connection to the universal light.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think something is, you know, wonderful about it, because we always talk about this sort of connection. What is beyond the limited self, the separate self? How do we experience this sense of samadhi, which is this moment when we feel this sense of connection to the whole, and which is in all traditions, right?
Yeah.
And it's through teachings like this, and this is a teaching. It's a movement, but there's a teaching going on at the same time. When you pay attention and you go within, and it's, the answer is sometimes not able to be put in words. It's the experience of that movement is the answer itself. And so it's profound, and I think really important. And one of the opening preambles to this podcast series was, you know, getting beyond the reductionist, mechanistic sort of worldview, which has served us well, but it's probably not going to be able to provide the solutions that we're looking for in society going forward.
No, that's right.
Incorporating activities like this, I think, are key for communities to get back into and be a part of. So, you know, what you're bringing to this community and what you're introducing down here, I think, is so important, and I'd encourage anybody to take advantage, because you know, you're here, you spend a lot of time here, but while you're also off to Bulgaria a few weeks ago, who knows where you'll be next. I mean, with all that expertise and knowledge you've got there, I just think people should really take the opportunity to experience it themselves.
And you know, with it just remind me about being in Bulgaria recently. It's really quite a magical space. On the 19th of August, so you get, again, not just the 19th. It's the focal point is the 19th, but 2 days before, 2 days after, there's these incredible camps happening. So there's 7 real lakes, and there's literally 7 natural lakes located about 3,000 meters up, approximately. You'd have to double check the height.
Sounds beautiful.
It's incredible. And it can be, last time I was there 8 years ago, it was 37 degrees, and you still had ice on the side of the mountain. This time it was much cooler, but I also had a chance to meet one of she's quite an older woman now, who wrote one of the main texts for Paneurythmy, and she also had direct connections with some of the people that worked directly with Peter Deunov. Peter Deunov died in 1944, so it isn't so long ago that people are still not connected. But I remember, you know, she was. I had a few sessions with her, and she was so precise. She was saying, "No, move forward 1 degree more." You know, it's just this sense of the movement, in the precision that some of them are actually doing, is quite astounding. Whilst at the same time, because there are some variations that are possible, there are other groups, even in Bulgaria, that do some of the movements a little bit differently. And unfortunately, then, as human nature is, you also have these different groups that want to, even though for Peter Deunov, harmony becomes absolutely vital. You get this these inner tensions that sometimes develops between groups, between do you do for the first one, do you do it with your palm up, or do you do it with your palm down? Do you do some movements with your fingers spread, or do you do it all the movements with your fingers together? And just instead of just allowing those differences, unfortunately, even in paneurythmy, then you have this, I'll call it these lower conflicts that can come in and take away from the essence and the beauty. In Sofia, I was doing paneurythmy in the just behind where one of the centers is, and most towns in Bulgaria do paneurythmy. Just to give you an idea, after the First World War, between the First World War and 1930, Peter Deunov had something like 40,000 followers in Bulgaria by 1930, and there's certainly a lot of people that continue to work paneurythmy in Bulgaria. A lot of towns have small groups. When I say small, in Sofia, there's more than one group that practices in the morning before going to work in parks with live musicians, which is beautiful. But there were about 200 people in that spot. Now, there were at least 3 different, if you like, traditions doing it. And it was all harmonious between the people that were actually doing it. But outside of actually doing it, then even, like I said, this is a good example. You have what is the true, correct way. So that's a bit of an unfortunate development. And
too much left brain.
Too much, absolutely, that's right.
Going on.
Good, spot on. That is in Gilchrist with
we've been listening to Davies, been listening to a lot of Ian McGilchrist.
Oh yeah.
And we had some interesting conversations about it. Yeah.
Oh good. Well, his book from about 10 years ago, The Master and His Emissary, and then the new 2-volume book,
you got
The Matter of Things. Just brilliant. Yeah, absolutely brilliant. Anyway, left hand logical thinking, taking away from the beauty of the harmony that is so important. And again, with truth, wisdom, and love as the 3 central qualities of the movement and the interactions between people.
What a great place to end this first conversation. I'm sure we'll have many more. There's lots more to follow up on, and you'll be a regular guest on this series, Jean-Michel. So thanks once again.
Thank you, David.
Pleasure having you on.
And
look forward to following up.
And looking forward to doing paneurythmy with
absolutely. It's the highlight of summer.
Great. Thank you, David.
Thanks, David.
We hope you've enjoyed this podcast with Jean-Michel David, and we look forward to your company in our next episode, In Body, In Mind.